Well, guys, it's good to be back here. I want to invite you to open your Bibles. We're going to be in 1 Samuel 23. 1 Samuel 23. Eventually, we'll be there. Yeah. All right, guys, let's find our seats. We're going to get started today. All right, I'm going to just start. All right. Well, if you guys look at your handouts, you will see that we are in 1 Samuel 23, 24, and we're skipping 25. We'll come back to that next week, 26 as well today. So 3 chapters, lots to cover. So hence why I'm giving you the kick in the butt and say, find your seats. No. Well, hey, if you are just joining us or maybe haven't been here a while, I do want to give you a little bit of a recap on where we are in the Bible as well as in the book of 1 Samuel. As we are making our way through this book, this wonderful study of 1 Samuel, it's helpful to keep everything in its proper perspective and context. And so where we are in the larger scheme of biblical history is that God has brought his people into the promised land. They have, for a time, rebelled. God brought judges to discipline them, bring them back, and rescue them, really. And then the nation said that they wanted a king. And so that brings us to the book of 1 Samuel, Israel's first king. No doubt, as many of you know, was Saul. Saul was a man who was rejected by the Lord. What we see, even if you flip back a couple chapters to 1 Samuel 15, is that the Lord rejected Saul in 1 Samuel 15. What we see about Saul is that he was a man of half measures of obedience. He really served the Lord when it was expedient for himself, but at other times he served himself. And so it was said about Saul that he had rejected the word of the Lord in verse 26 of 15, and that the Lord had rejected him from being king over Israel. Well, right off the heels of that, God anoints another king. He chooses a king of his own choice. You will remember that Saul was chosen in many ways by the people as they saw him as a man of great stature and the type of man that they wanted to be king. And David doesn't really fit that mold, but he's a man after God's own heart. And so God anoints him to be king. He is in really God's view king, though he is not serving as king yet, and it will be a long time until that is fully realized. Then in 1 Samuel 17, you'll remember David fights Goliath, the giant Goliath. Really, the kingship and the role of king was established by the people so that their king would go out and fight their enemies to deliver them. What's fascinating is you see in 1 Samuel 17 is Saul is sticking in the background. He's not rising to the occasion and doing exactly what his job is, but what you see David do is he is a man after God's own heart who loves the honor of God and is moved to face this giant. And he does so that God's name would be honored. He finds victory, which leads us to chapters 18 through 20, where right off the heels of David's slaying of Goliath, what you find is that Saul instantly, it seems, has tremendous jealousy for David. In fact, they were singing songs about Saul and David. You'll see in chapter 18, verse 7. And it says, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. Now, for the king of Israel, this is not a thing that is acceptable. He doesn't like this. And so through the course of these 3 chapters, 18, 19, and 20, I believe it's 7 times that Saul seeks to kill David because he's stealing his fame, he's stealing his power and prestige among the nations, and Saul is seeing the writing on the wall, this man will one day rule my kingdom. And so Saul, suspicious as he is, sees David as a usurper and tries to kill him. Eventually, after 7 attempts, David finally gets the hint and says, I need to skip town and get out of here, right? So chapter 21, he does just that. He leaves. Along the way, he finds provision through the help of a priest named Ahimelech, who comes and helps him, gives him bread as well as a sword with which to protect himself. David then flees to Gath, this Philistine city, where he is apprehended, taken into custody. He feigns madness, gets away, and then goes and finds refuge in a cave, the cave of Adullam. And it's there that 400 other men in Israel who are like David, in fact, this passage describes it in chapter 22, verse 2, that these men were in distress, and they were everyone who was in debt and everyone who was bitter in soul came and gathered to David, and he became commander over them. This is really the beginnings of David's faithful, loyal crew that's going to be around him. And they are a motley crew. There is not much there. It's a very ragtag group. Right after this, and we were here last week, Saul the king goes and finds the priest who helped David and charges him with conspiracy, charges him with helping David in his flight from Saul. And what happens is 85 priests are killed at the hands of Saul, according to his blessing. And what you see at the end of that, and this is important for today's passage, look at 22 verse 20. It says, "But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David." So he flees and he finds David, and he's going to find refuge there. I read that because we're going to come back to that in our passage today. Well, that's where we've been. Now, where are we going? Well, gentlemen, I'll tell you, it's a little bit more of the same, right? David is being pursued. His life is in danger. Saul, actually, where we are going today, will pursue David 4 different times in 4 different locations with the intent and aim at killing David. Now, you can read this and go, man, this seems to go on and on. It seems to be so repetitive. And to a degree, it is. In fact, what's interesting is when David killed Goliath, he was likely just in his latter teens. And up until the time where David is anointed king at Hebron in 2 Samuel chapter 2, he's probably about 30 years old. So what this means is that while this is seeming a little repetitive to us, David for 10 years is fleeing for his life. His life is in danger. And it's in the course of those 10 years and the repeated occurrences that he learns some of his greatest lessons and becomes the type of man who will be a king after God's own heart and a king whom God would use. And so sometimes the repetition is actually a good thing because we can learn and reflect on God's care. Well, I've hinted at the fact that Saul is going to pursue David 4 times. There's a power struggle that is going to happen in the 3 chapters that we're going to look at today. It's so clear. It's a conflict between good and evil. It's a conflict between David and Saul. And it is this power struggle that will cause us to ask, who is going to win? In fact, it's interesting when you look at these 3 chapters, the word hand, keep an eye out for it when we're reading through it, is repeated 17 times throughout the chapters. It's one of the most repeated words in here, and it is significant. Just a few samplings of how the word is used. It speaks of being given into one's hand or given over to one's hand. The passage says to strengthen one's hand, or even to put out or to stretch out one's hand to take another's life. And so you see all of these instances, and you're left wondering, in this pursuit, this constant struggle between David and Saul, whose hand will prevail? Who's going to win? And David is certainly a man without a home, certainly a man in trial, certainly a man fleeing for his life. But it is helpful to realize and to remember that while David's hand and Saul's hand are fighting against one another and David is fleeing, that there is an unspoken hand, an invisible hand that is ruling over the entire narrative. And that is God's hand. Why is this important? It's important because when there are moments, even in our lives, as we're applying this to ourselves, when it seems that the end is uncertain and our well-being is uncertain, God's hand is ruling over everything and directing his purposes to his intended end. Gentlemen, I think this is helpful for us to realize because God's hand will not be thwarted. It will not be resisted. We cannot stay God's hand. He accomplishes all of his purposes. And we're going to see that in our passage today. And so I will say, as David is learning this lesson, we also should be learning this lesson, that God is in control no matter our circumstances. No matter how bad life looks, no matter how bleak the outcome might be, God is in control and is holding all things in his hands. Certainly, he is holding his servants, his children, in his hands. I would even say that God is never surprised by, nor is he powerless over the trials that come upon his people. I'm going to read that again. Focus on that if you feel you are in a trial today. God is never surprised by, nor is he powerless over the trials that come upon his people, even if those trials might seem to seek to destroy us. In fact, what we learn is that God preserves his people. He establishes, supports, and sustains them. And God will, either in this life or the next, confound and expose the purposes of the wicked and establish his children. And so that's what we're going to see today. We're going to see that in David's life, and we're going to see how he does that to Saul. Gentlemen, if you are a child of God today, then I believe that God has set his favor upon you. In fact, Scripture says that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ. We are a new creation. He loves us. He blesses us. He, in fact, calls us his own children. 1 John chapter 3 says, see what kind of love the Father has lavished upon us, that we should be called the children of God, and so we are. So, gentlemen, I want to say today that if you are his child, you are favored. He sets his hand upon you to establish, confirm, and bless you. Now, that may not look like what we want it to look like in our lives, but nonetheless, he is there. And the opposite is likewise true, that the mightiest of earthly powers, should they oppose his reign, his rule, they will never prevail. Not in the end. And it may seem for a moment that they do, but in the end, they will not prevail. In God's hand, we are secure. And so we are going to see then today as we walk through this passage, now that I've spent 10 or 15 minutes on introduction, right? As we're walking through these 3 chapters, what is God's hand doing? And how is God's hand being a blessing to David? And even how can God's hand be a comfort and a blessing to us as we're walking through our own trials? Well, gentlemen, let's start in chapter 23, verse 1. Now they told David, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floor. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, arise, go to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hands. Gentlemen, the first thing that we're seeing here is that God is guiding David, and he is guiding him to rescue this city. The city Keilah was located along the Israelite, Judah, Philistine border. And it was a town of Israel that belonged to Israel. And what we know about the Philistines is they were a raiding, marauding group of people who went and picked on the helpless, right? And David, many times is known as the Philistine killer, goes and rises to Israel's cause and defeats the Philistines. And so, certainly, as this is happening, word travels to David. They make him aware. Who the they is, we don't know. We don't know who told David, but David learned of this event. And he goes and seeks the Lord. You see in verse 2, he inquires the Lord, shall I go and fight them? The Lord obviously blesses David. He says, yes, go and fight them, go and attack. And yet what we see in verse 3 is that the men who were with David were afraid in Judah, how much more so than if they went to fight the Philistines. And here's where you got to go back to the past chapter and you remember that everyone who was with David were those who were in debt, who were bitter in soul, and were distressed. And so they're obviously worried about going in open battle and fighting these Philistines. God, what's going to happen? What are you going to do? Certainly the outcome is uncertain here. I think it's important to know or to notice that David intervenes, but before he intervenes, he seeks the hand of the Lord. David's not going to go where God is not calling him, and so he is doing that. He is seeking the hand of the Lord. We don't know how God is speaking to David here. Maybe the prophet Gad is still with him, but for one way or another, God is speaking to David, and that is a very important point to note. God is speaking to David. These men who were with him were obviously afraid. There was only, at this point, 400 with them. We'll see a little later down that number rises to 600. But whether these were men of war is left unspoken. All we know is that their state of mind was one of instability. And David says, let's go and fight, the warrior that he was. David, because of their fear, inquires of the Lord a second time. And the Lord said, arise and go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. And here we come to something that's very important, gentlemen. And that is that David knew that his success was dependent upon the Lord going before him. Because David knows, as we've seen many times throughout the scripture, that the battle belonged to the Lord, not to David. And so did its outcome. That David would have success only insofar as God went before him. And this is largely a cause of why Saul is now being seen to be inefficient in much of his kingdom, in much of his rule, because God is not going before him. God has abandoned him. He has rejected Saul. But to David, he says, I will walk before you. I will go before you. I will give the Philistines into your hand. Read verse 5 with me. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. David intervenes. He is a savior in many ways here. He saves this city. And then you get to verse 6, something very interesting. When Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Why is that verse really significant? Have we seen that name before? Go back to the last chapter. You read in chapter 22, verse 20, but one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Now, why is he fleeing? What's happening to his family and all of his brothers and fellow priests? What's happening, gentlemen? They're being killed, 85 of them. And where does he flee to? According to chapter 23, verse 6. Fled to David to where? To Keilah. So David is already there. Why is this significant? It's significant because verse 20 of chapter 22 and verse 6 of chapter 23 happen at the same time, which means verses 1 through 5 of 23, when David is saving Keilah, is happening at the same moment that Saul is killing the priests. Do you see that? This is really significant because you see a contrast between Saul, the king, who has rejected God and who has been rejected by God, and David, God's king. And what are they doing? They are doing two completely different things. One is killing the priests of God, slaying them, and one is saving a helpless city within Israel. The very thing that the king was supposed to be doing. One is a savior, one is a destroyer. These are two diametrically opposed kings. You see also another contrast between these two individuals, these two gentlemen, and that God was silent to Saul and he disclosed his will to David. And what an immense privilege this was for David. In fact, this was the reason why Saul was afraid of David. If you look back to 1 Samuel 18, verse 12, it says, Saul was afraid of David. Why? Because the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. You see, David had something that Saul did not have. It was the hand and blessing of God over his life. And Saul knew that this would be his undoing. Well, we get into verse 7, and it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah. And Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. So he decides to go and set up a siege against this city. Look at verse 9. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him. And so he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Now, if you go back up to verse 6, you will remember that Abiathar, when he came, brought the ephod in his hand. Does anybody know what an ephod is today? Right? Okay, some of us know, right? But in the 21st century, I mean, who of you don't know what an ephod is in here, right? That's the better question, right? Well, it's important to describe this a little bit. An ephod was part of their priestly garment. It was like a breast piece, if you will, that the priests would wear, and it was representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. And on this ephod was likely a pocket which held the Urim and the Thummim, right? Now, if you don't know what an ephod is, you probably really won't know what an Urim and a Thummim is, right? What in the world? Well, this priestly garment was used for eliciting an oracle from God or God's will, his divine purpose. And these Urim and Thummims, right? Probably two different things, maybe pebbles or sticks or made from precious metal, one likely light, one likely dark, and it was used for determining the will of God, like casting lots. Or maybe there was a pocket and they would shake it and they would draw out either a light stone or a dark stone and determine, is the Lord blessing this or is he not blessing this? And God would work that way. It is one of the ways which he determined that he would communicate to these priests. So David, knowing that Saul's going to come and siege this city and bring harm upon him, David says to Abiathar, bring the ephod. Let's see what the will of the Lord is saying. Should I escape? Should I run? Is Saul really going to come and lay siege to the city? Will the city hand me over to Saul that they might destroy me? What you see in verse 11, the end of verse 11, the Lord said he will come down. Saul is coming. And then in verse 12, the Lord says again, they will surrender you. So David, as you see in verse 13, and his 600 men arose and departed from Keilah and went wherever they could go. You even sense the distress there, wherever they could go. They didn't have a clear purpose in mind of what might be safe. They are simply fleeing, and they are fleeing for their lives. What's fascinating is that this city, who David just saved, had in its heart and intention to betray David. Why? Why did they want to betray David? You know, I think it's possible that maybe they had learned of Saul killing the priests. And they're putting together in their mind, anybody who helps and gives aid to David are dead men. We need to betray him, hand him over to Saul. And yet, throughout all of this, I think what we can draw from it, and the question we have to ask, how does this apply to our own lives? I think it's that the Lord guides us, and he goes before us. And he ensures our steps. In fact, you read in Psalm 37, verse 23 and 24, the steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong. It doesn't say that we won't fall, right? we will fall, gentlemen. But it says that when the Lord is establishing our steps, we will not be cast headlong, for the Lord upholds his hand. God is guiding and directing our steps. No matter how hard the trial might be, no matter how uncertain the outcome is, God, through his word, guides our steps. And while he communicated to David in ways that he has never communicated to me, and I doubt he never will communicate to me or to any one of you, the reality, though, still remains God communicates to us. And he communicates to us through his word. In fact, Scripture says that his divine power is granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him. How do we find the knowledge of him? Through his word. So God speaks to us. He speaks to us. I also think that it's interesting that Abiathar, this priest who was living here, really comes by default the next high priest because all the other priests have died. And what did David have access to? God's high priest. Gentlemen, what do we have access to? Jesus, the great high priest, who communicates on our behalf and who communicates in us because he lives in our hearts. You see, God guides us no matter the outcome. David is also submitted to this guidance. He is submitted to God to go wherever God would have him go, to do whatever God would have him do. I also think that in this passage, you see something very much like Christ, because David is in many ways here a rejected Savior. I think he learns obedience through suffering, just as it is said of Christ. Well, gentlemen, let's go to the next point. God's hand not only guides, but it also strengthens. God's hand strengthens. Maybe I'd encourage you to insert yourself into David's position here. It's been years now, many attempts of feeling alone, feeling in danger, feeling that your life is being held on by a simple thread. How would you feel? Certainly discouraged. You would feel to be a beleaguered man. What does beleaguered mean? I had to look it up too. Don't feel bad. It means suffering or being subject to constant or repeated trouble or harassment. That's how David felt. And yet, in the midst of this, God comforts. So in the midst of our trials, when life seems to go awry, when we don't know the solution, we have to remember God is a comforting God. In fact, we read that in Romans 15, verse 5. It says that God is the God of endurance and encouragement. Then in 2 Corinthians 1, it says that God is the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions. What are some of the means by which God comforts us? Well, I'd encourage you guys to look around your table right now. I think those are some of the means by which God comforts us. You know, it's interesting because Paul says something really fascinating in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 6. He says, but God who comforts the downcast comforted us. How did he comfort us? By the coming of Titus. That God comforts us through brothers in Christ who come to our aid, come alongside us and walk a path with us. And that's exactly what God is going to have for David here. In verse 15 of chapter 23, we see that David's dear friend Jonathan comes to his aid. Saul's own son. The one for whom Saul is trying to maintain his kingdom so that Jonathan might have his kingdom one day. Jonathan knows the kingdom rightfully belongs to David. So you see in verse 15, David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. No, really, right? That's what you want to say to David. You're just now figuring this out? But David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horish. Notice this. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horish and strengthened his hand in God. Gentlemen, when you see a downcast brother, it is your responsibility to strengthen his hand in the Lord. Not to strengthen his hand in his own might or in any other deceptive power, but in God. Jonathan went there and did that. How did he do that? Well, we see some things that he says to David. The first thing he says to him, what do you see? What is it there? Verse 17. What does he say? What's the first thing? Do not fear. Which implies what? Was David afraid? He might have been. Certainly the circumstances might have led him to fear. It's actually interesting. One commentator says that these words are always spoken, which we see a lot in the Bible, always in terrifying circumstances. When fear is the natural and reasonable thing to do. The words as we hear them in the Bible are never an empty attempt at comfort, but an expression of a reality that is more powerful than the terrifying circumstances. So Jonathan is saying there is a reality that is more powerful than your terrifying circumstances. What is that reality? It is the promises that have been delivered to David. What are those promises? He says, "For the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you." You see the selfless nature of this young man, Jonathan, who would have a right to argue his claim to the throne and says, "No, I will set it aside. I will stand next to you as you rule and reign. Do not fear. The Lord is going to establish you as king over Israel." And with these words, he strengthens David in the promises of God. Gentlemen, when you're in a moment in your life where you seem discouraged, dismayed, depressed, you need to return to the promises of God. And you need to have men around you who remind you of those promises, even when you don't want to hear them. Because there may be a time in your life where you don't want to hear them. You need to gather those men around you. And you need to invite their counsel into your life, even when you don't want it. And I will say also that you need to be the type of man who seeks others in that same way, even if they don't ask you, right? I mean, there's been plenty of times where I've had to go and pursue a brother, and I know he doesn't want me to. And I know that there's times where you guys have had to do that as well. Well, gentlemen, we're iron men, right? As iron sharpens iron, so one man should sharpen another. That's what Jonathan is doing here. Because the Lord strengthens, and he does it through Jonathan. What do we see next? The third point. God's hand protects. God's hand protects. So David flees. He's in the wilderness of Ziph, as we saw in verse 14. We're going to see the second account where Saul is pursuing after David. And it actually says in verse 19 that the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah saying, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horish on the hill in Hachilah, which is south of Jeshimon?" I'm not going to describe to you where that's at, right? We'll just let it lie. Here's the point. They're saying, David's here. Saul, we've got David. You better come and get him. What should we learn from this? We should learn the extent and the power of Saul's reign and fury over the nation of Israel. It's not for no reason that David fears for his life and fled even just a few chapters ago to the land of the Philistines, because he feels there's not a safe square foot of land in all of Israel where he can rest his head and lay down. Saul's reign and fury and madness go that far, and even the Ziphites are handing him over. Now, this wilderness of Ziph, it's not a wilderness like we think of it. When you hear wilderness, you think, oh, that's great. Let's go live in the wilderness, right? No, this is dry, arid, desert wasteland. And you think plants don't grow in the Antelope Valley? This is far worse, far worse. That's where David's fleeing. That's where he's trying to find the protection of the Lord. Well, they say in verse 20, the end of verse 20, our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. Really interesting verse here in 21. Pay attention to this. And Saul said, May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Do you see that Saul takes upon himself to invoke the name of the Lord in a blessing for the Ziphites' willingness to betray God's very own anointed king? I mean, what hubris, right? Big head. He thinks he can rule and reign over all Israel. He thinks he's the King of Kings, but gentlemen, he's not the King of Kings. And he shouldn't be using the name of the Lord like this. He's still a little uncertain, so he says in verse 22, go make yet more sure. In other words, I don't want to pursue after David and this come to nothing. Double check. That's what he's saying. Figure out exactly where he is and I will flee after him. And he does that. So skip down to verse 25 and it says, and Saul and his men went to seek him, that is seek David. And David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. This is potentially the closest that Saul has gotten to David. This is the tightening of the noose, if you will. It is the nail-biting moment where David is fleeing from Saul, and the outcome, certainly for David and his beleaguered men, is entirely uncertain. God, will you betray us? Will you hand us over into the hands of our enemies? Are we going to be like the 85 priests who were slaughtered at the hand of Saul, and no one rose up to defend their honor and to defend justice? What's going to happen? Imagine their hearts beating out of their chest, them running as hard as they can. It says in verse 26 that Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them. This is a dangerous moment. And what happens in the dangerous moment? Well, the Lord protects and delivers. There you go. See, I love that. What happens in the dangerous moment? You should have let it go. I wanted to know, man. I know. You seemed a little worried, man. I think David was probably moving as quick as you were, man. That's awesome. Well, what happens? Verse 27, a messenger came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land. And Saul was diverted in the nick of the moment. Gentlemen, without a moment to spare. This is something that's not a coincidence. It's not something that could be repeated. It is the hand of the Lord. And the irony is, who was the man who just earlier in this very chapter proved he could defeat the Philistines and save Israel from their threat? David. And Saul now has to go and fight them. I think it's helpful for us to remember that it is the Lord who protects, and he is in charge of nations, and he is in charge of men, and nothing happens apart from his sovereign will. Proverbs 19, verse 21 says, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. David escapes and he flees because the Lord protects. Well, gentlemen, in the next 10 minutes, we're going to try to go through the next 2 chapters. Okay? I know you'll be gracious to me. What we're going to see here is that God's hand both confounds and confirms. It confounds Saul and all of his purposes and confirms David in his righteousness, in his innocence, and establishes David's own hand. In fact, what we're going to see in chapter 24 and 26, the reason why I'm linking them together, even being willing to skip a chapter here, is because they are very similar in their detail and content. And the Lord is doing just this. Now, we've seen 2 attempts at David's life so far. Saul is pursuing after David, and Saul seems to be nearly successful in both attempts. What we're going to see in these next two attempts is Saul pursues after David, and God almost delivers Saul into David. In fact, I would say he does deliver Saul into David's hand in both attempts. Saul is pursuing, but David is the one with the power. And why does he have the power? Because God's on his side. So we're going to see these two things. The first is when Saul's robe is cut by David. The narrative picks up similar to where we've been already, that Saul's returned from following the Philistines in 24 verse 1, and he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Now, if you know anything of En-Gedi, it's on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, and it's a land known with cliffs and caves and rocks, and there's wild goats living there and springs from which to get water. And David and his men make this their hideout, their robber's roost, if you will, and they're hanging there trying to flee from Saul. So Saul takes, you see in verse 2, 3,000 chosen men of Israel. I imagine these are the best fighters, the best of the best, and they are pursuing after David. David is now outnumbered 5-1. And it is his beleaguered motley this ragtag group of men who are fighting and facing off against 5-1, the greatest warriors in Israel. Well, along the way, you see in verse 3, Saul goes into a cave. Why is he going into a cave, gentlemen? To relieve himself. He's got to go to the bathroom. Now, normally and thankfully, Scripture omits these kinds of details, right? Can you imagine what a messy affair we'd have in the Word if it didn't all the time? But this detail is important, too important to be omitted. Because who is in the cave hiding? David and his men in the innermost parts of the cave. What do his men do? It's obvious. This is what I would do if I was standing there with David. They say in verse 4, they're nudging David. They're saying, David, here is the day which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. This is being caught with your pants down. David is going to go, well, what is he going to do, right? That's the question. His men are certainly saying, go and kill Saul. He has all the power. It says, then David arose. And what do you think you would do in that situation? He arose and stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe. I think it's an understatement when it says there stealthily. Not even noticed by Saul. Can you imagine the skill that is needed to do this? How about the sharpness of the sword? It would have been a quick and an easy affair for David, this revered warrior, this man of war who has killed tens of thousands, to make an end to Saul while he's doing his business. He was on his phone. There you go. Scrolling the feeds, man. What do we see about David? His heart struck him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Even that made him feel guilty because he had put his hand against Saul, the Lord's anointed. It says in verse 6, he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to put my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed. Maybe you might be tempted to ask yourself, and I think this is the right question, why did David spare him? I think it's important for us to realize that David was resolved to become king, not by the power of his own hand, but by the will and the working of God's hand. I have two quotes for you in your notes, one by John Woodhouse, one by Dale Ralph Davis. We'll read both of these right now. John Woodhouse said, David understood that the kingdom which would certainly be his one day, was not for him to take by his own power. The kingdom had been given to Saul by God, and it was up to God to take it from him in his own time and in his own way. Dale Ralph Davis stated, Yahweh's will must be achieved in Yahweh's way. The end that God has ordained must be reached by the means that God approves. And gentlemen, here is the temptation to shortcut. We've all experienced it. It comes to all of God's servants. I would even say that it comes to Christ as he was tempted in the wilderness and Satan tempted him. Just bow down to me and I will give you everything that is rightfully yours to begin with. I mean, how many times in our lives have we experienced trials and difficulties and what seems to be an insurmountable obstacle, and maybe there's a cheap, easy way out and we could take it and maybe no one would be the wiser and we could be done with all the heartache. Well, have you ever asked yourself that maybe God has ordained the heartache for a reason? And it's through the heartache that he's going to accomplish his purposes and make you into the man that he wants you to be. David is willing to surrender to God no matter what. What's fascinating is this is not the first time that a robe has been cut within the book of 1 Samuel, because you remember Samuel, when he told Saul that the Lord has rejected you and he has torn the kingdom from you, what did Saul do? He reached out and grabbed Saul's robe and tore it. So I think in many ways, this is symbolic of God tearing the kingdom yet further away from Saul. David confronts Saul, and can you imagine being Saul when you see the corner of your robe in David's hand? And David's innocence is confirmed. David said in verse 11, "See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hand. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it." Later, he says in verse 14, "After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? Why are you pursuing after me? Leave me alone." Saul is led in verse 17 to admit, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil." And then he says something shocking in verse 20. "And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand." So Saul leaves, David leaves. Has Saul learned the lesson? What do you guys think? No, he hasn't learned the lesson. In fact, he keeps pursuing after David. And that's where you get to chapter 26, really a deja vu moment, because it seems like all of chapter 24 yet over again. It seems like the same chapter. As Saul is once again pursuing David with his 3,000 men, and they're there. The Ziphites betray David again a second time and say, "David's with us, come and get him." And David goes with his spies and they seek out where Saul is, and they see him laying there in the midst of his camp, and he's there in the center and his spear is in the ground and everybody's asleep because the Lord had put a great sleep upon them. And David says, "Let's go down there to their camp." Right? That's being bold. So he walks down there with this man named Abishai. Abishai sees them there. They make their way to the center of the camp. Verse 8, you will see. And Abishai says to David, much like the men in the cave who said to David, "Go and kill him." Abishai says, "God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now, please," I sense his urgency, right? He wants to do this. "Just let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice. Oh, pretty please, David. Let me kill David. Let me kill Saul." That's what Abishai is saying. Let's put this to rest. I mean, Saul certainly is a man who refuses to learn because he's not the type of man that's going to learn. He's a fool. The Lord has rejected him. He has turned him over to his own wayward ways, and certainly his own wayward way of thinking. He's a man who suppresses the truth. David sees here his yet again vulnerable situation. David could easily kill him. And David said, as the Lord lives, verse 10, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into the battle and perish. God will take care of it. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed, but take now his spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let's go. You guys have heard this saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, David's being willing to be fooled twice. And you're still left to ask why. David is certainly saying this is the same petty king with the same self-preserving suspicions, the same maniacal and endless pursuit of me to kill my life, and yet he exercises mercy. It's a fascinating turn of events. I don't think I would have chose the same. Here's what we learn from this. David is a man who was like Christ. And he learned to work salvation not by his own hand, but to wait for the salvation that comes from the Lord. Knowing, remember, there's this power struggle. Whose hand will prevail? That's the question that we're left asking throughout this entire narrative. I started with that and I want to end with that. There is an unspoken, unseen hand. It is the hand of God, which will never be thwarted, can never be stayed or turned aside from. And it is protecting, it is guiding, it is comforting, it is strengthening, it is establishing David. And no matter what Saul does, he will always be confounded. And David knows that very fact. And he says, I will rest in the hand of God no matter where it takes me. And I'm not going to achieve my ends by my ways. I'll let the Lord lead the way. And so he is innocent. I'll let you guys read the rest of the chapter for your own pleasure and reread those 3 chapters. There's a lot of good in there that we've missed. But gentlemen, I want to tell you guys can trust the Lord. And no matter how bleak things look, his hand is in control and he's got us. And it is a gracious hand to be found in, right? Let's pray. Lord, we love you and we thank you for your tremendous kindness towards David, but also your tremendous kindness towards us, Lord, that you would make us your sons. Lord, I ask that you would unite us to you and unite us to one another, Lord, that we might strengthen one another and look to your saving hand, Lord. We thank you for bringing salvation through your Son, Jesus Christ, Lord. We know that there is no other way but by faith in his perfect work. It is in that work we rest our trust. In his wonderful, precious name we pray.